Okay, I project everything. So today, here we go. Okay, move over. Oh, can one of you guys turn one of the lights off, please? Thank you. That's perfect. Okay, and then, oh, this, yeah. Okay, cool. So, I wanted to play around with, let's see this. What's called plotting an unknown number of data points. Put it this way: if I go and ask you to, like I did on the homework, I believe, to plot a set of answers. Say you have those. Say you have that equation where you're solving for the radius of the pellet after a certain amount of reaction time, right? And ask you to plot the variation in that pellet size from time equals 0 to time equals 5,000 seconds, right? You can figure out how many values there are going to be. That's what's called. So creating an array to store all those values is relatively straightforward. It makes sense. You just have to figure out how many values there are going to be. However, for something like plotting the residual, that's something that we don't know how many they're going to be. It's going to depend on the method. It'll depend on, meaning fixed point iteration, Newton's method, whatever. It's going to depend on what value you start from. Start from radius of 0.1 or 1.7. It'll take a different number of iterations to find the answer. Depends on what answer you're trying to find. If you're trying to find the answer at time equals 0, it's going to take forever. It's going to take thousands upon thousands of iterations, but trying to find the radius at time is time at 5,000 seconds might take 90 iterations. The long story short, we just don't know how many there are. Same thing with reading data out of text files. We don't, because it doesn't come in all as an array, we don't necessarily know how many data points there are going to be. So we don't know how big of an array we need to make. So how do we deal with all this stuff? We talked about this once before, but I thought it might be good to bring up one more time. So let's give it a shot. Okay, so we're going to start off by trying to read from a file. All right. So I'm going to just make up a new text file quick, and I'm going to put 5 values in it, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Cool. So input values.text. I'm essentially just opening Notepad and putting five numbers in it, just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Save it off, and I'm back to my Python file. All right, so I've just made a text file, has 5 numbers in it. I've saved it in the same place as my Python file. That's the file that I'm going to read from. Also need to not forget what I called it. Input values.text. So I'm definitely going to forget that. Okay. Yes, that's the text file that I want to read from. All right. So let's grab. Oh, never saved. Okay. All right. So let's start a new Python file. So I'm going to start with reading in an unknown amount of data via strings. So this is for the example of if my if my text file has both text and numbers in it. And they're often on the same line. They might be intermixed. Well, not intermixed, but at least might be on the same line. And numpy.load text might be either difficult to use or impossible to use, one of the two. That's kind of the scenario that I have. But I want to read my data. So how do we do this before? We started off by saying we need to open the file, right? Called mine input values.txt. Need to open it to read. Okay. So where do I go from here? If I want to just read data out of this text file, if I want to print to the console every line that's in this text file, what's kind of my next step? I have the file open, files encased in file ID. What do I do next? I want to print out every row just to start off. Okay, well, let's do that. So file ID is the entire file. It's the identifier for the whole file. Unfortunately, means that Olby gets the identifier for the file back when I try to print it, right? So I need to do something a little bit more to it. I need to actually start extracting data from it. So how we did that before, okay, so this is opening up the input data file. How we did that before is by extracting rows from it. And we said in Python, it's kind of cool because everything can be used as an iterable. Everything can be used as what a loop goes through. So we're going to iterate through every row of the input file by just saying for, to put any named for a variable here in by just doing that. And if I say any name for a variable, because I can really put anything I want. It could be rows, it could be it could be blah. It's just a variable. The same way that we usually do for I in range blah. I'm going to call it for row in range file ID, because how Python works is that when I do this, when I say hey, put file ID in where I'd usually put range, it'll start iterating through that file one row at a time, which is super cool, right? So that means that this loop can pull out each row in the file. It's just up to me to parse that row into data that I want. So row is now that entire row. It is a string that is everything on that line. If I wanted to see that, I could add a little bit more text here. That's my input file on the left. That's input values.txt. I'm going to close that guy up, save that. And when I run my Python file now, I see that is the first that's from the first time through my for loop, right? It's taking that entire first row, which is a string because there's letters and numbers in there. It's always a string, but here I definitely know it's a string. And it's printing that out. So I know beyond shadow of a doubt that row is extracting every single row of row represents each row in that file one at a time. So that means that if I anticipate there being anything else in that row, I'll need to figure out where my numbers are. That's why it's kind of nice to put your numbers all on the left instead of having to dig through all the different strings in a row if you put a descriptor or whatever in there. So put all your input values on the same side so you know where they are. So I want to start extracting stuff. The first thing I'm going to do is take that one string, that is the entire row, and I need to split that up into parts. So how do we do that before? How do we split the string up? There we go. Now, so that automatically looks for spaces but between strings and says, oh, if there's a space, this string, I'm going to call that something separate from the next thing, and separate from the next thing, separate from the next thing, and the next thing. So if we do that, let's print whatever we get out of there. Now we have these array looking like things. And if you look at my first line here, one look here, dash, dash, here is some more text. It's taken that sentence and cut it up by spaces. And if I look at my list here, my array, everything that's inside of those square brackets, each thing that's separated by commas is one array element, if you will. So if I can be cool and draw things, means that like this guy is the first element in the array, meaning that its address is what? 0, not 0, 0, because this is one array and it's only one dimensional. There's only a row. So it's just 0, but you're right. So, and then each one of these that's separated by commas is another element in the array. So, okay, this is handy. Means since that when I use split, I get an array out, and the first element in the array is going to be at least the way that I set up my text file, is going to be the number that I want out. Note this is true even when there's only one thing in the array. It's still an array. It's just an array of one element. So if I want what's in that array, I have to go for element 0. Okay? We're on the same page? Cool. All right. All right, so let's pop back into our code. All right, so I've done that. I want to get my number. That's for value. Split line is where I've saved the result of row.split. So to get that number out of split line, which is my array, how do I do it? All I want's the number that was on that row. Yep. I just call it. It's an array, so I just have to tell it what element in the array I want to play with. I want to play with element 0. It's the first one, and that's my extract. Cool. So I print that off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Great. I'm pulling them out. That's awesome. However, there's a trick here. There's that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Are those integers? Are they floats? Or are they strings? They're strings, right? Because they were strings. That's what we saw in the array. What's called when we printed off the results of row.split. We saw that everything was in not parentheses. quotes, which means that they're strings. And we haven't done anything to make them anything else. So those numbers are still strings. We want to do math with them. What do we have to do? Yeah, we need to convert them to a number. And int would work perfectly for these because they are all ints. Although if they weren't ints, or if we expected them to not be ints, we'd have to convert them to floats. So just for sake of generalizability, if you will, I'm just going to convert to a float here. So when I run this guy, everything should have a 0.0 after it. Cool. So actually, I have numbers, pulled them out, got them. Need to do something with them. Need to save them as an array, because at the end of the day, we were talking about doing all this in context of like plotting something, right? So if I'm pulling these values out of my text file, I want to plot them, I'm going to have to put them in an array. Problem is, not like NumPy load text, unlike NumPy load text, I don't automatically get how many rows there are in the file. It's not something that I just know. It's actually not something that Python will tell you either. You have to kind of work. You kind of have to work at it. So, yeah. So let's clean this up a little bit and see if we can play around with that question. I'm just going to go back into my text file. I'm going to get rid of back up there. I'm going to make a second column of numbers. Actually, you know what? Let's make it one more than our original column so that we know what's going on. And I'm going to call this a whole bunch of X and Y data points, right? That's what I want to plot. Could you pull this in using load text? Totally. Do we want to make an example of how to do it without load text in case you had other stuff floating around here? Yes. So we're going to. So we're going to pull this in as a string and try to plot those X and Y values. We're going to say that column's X, that column's Y. We're going to try to plot those against one another. That's our goal. All right. So we know how to pull text in. That's straightforward. We know how to get those values, we know how to get numbers, sweet. But we have to deal with something else here, right? First thing is that unlike in our initial example, this text file doesn't start with numbers. It starts with data that, frankly, in the code we don't care about and can't do anything. X and Y, right? Well, sort of. Well, it starts with something that we don't want to plot. Put it that way. It does start with something that we might want to steal to put in as our X label and our Y label, but it's not something that we want to plot. So we're gonna have to use something the first time through our loop here. If I jump over to my code on line 8, we're not going to always want to do. We're always, if I look at line 9, I'm not always going to want to assume that I have a number. Because the first time through, I'm going to have labels. So I'm going to have to think about this a little bit differently. I'm going to have to keep track of what row I'm on. Thing 2, I have to figure out how many rows I have. That's still an open question. So in this case, you got a couple of options. One is you can use the VStack method that we talked about like a month ago or so, and kind of grow your array as you go. I'm going to show you one other option that you have. It's a little bit more brute force, but it works. So we want to know how many rows of numbers we have, right? So let's count them directly. So I'm going to set up a counter. I'm going to iterate through every row in the file. The first time through, we're going to skip a row because we know that there aren't numbers in the first row, right? So if this is my first time, because counter is 0, it is the first time, I'm going to, I'm going to skip the rest of this loop, except what I'm going to do is I'm going to set counter equal to 1 first. So I'm going to, so if I start from line 7, I set up a counter. I set it to start at 0. I grab my first row out of my file. I say, if this is my first time through this loop, if this is my first row, because if it's my first row, counter is 0. If it's that first row, increment counter to 1 and skip everything else here. Effectively, it skips my first row, right? If that's not true, or rather, if I'm still in this loop, then I'll go and just process everything. So we can say, so we can just keep on going and say counter equals counter plus 1. And if I keep on doing that, I'll go through my entire file. And done. Let's close it out. I will need to open it a second time for when I want to read data from it. And I need to do that in order to reset my position in the file to the start of it instead of the end. So how are we feeling about that first bit? Does that make some sense? Any questions about it? All right, so to make it a little bit more clear, say total values is equal to count to counter. So I know how many values are in the file because I've gone through the whole file. I've counted them all up. So now there's one set of values per row. Done. Great. I have the total number of values that are in that file. Now that I know that I need arrays in order to store them in so I can plot them. So I can just say X array equals zeros, total values, sweet. Y array, same thing, sweet. And I know that they're all the right size because I've already gone through and I've counted how many things are there. Although you might cry foul because I haven't imported numpy yet. So. And might as well import matplotlib while I'm here. All right. So we all there? All right, so I can go down in here. All done counting the number of rows in my text files. Open up the file again, create my storage arrays. Down, I iterate through throw the input file, and I want to store my X and Y values for plotting. All right, so if I look at the rows of my text file here, if you think, okay, each row is going to be one array, right? What elements of the array belong to the X values, and what elements of the array belong to my Y values? Right. First one's the X, second's the Y's. Means my X value sits at an array address of 0. My Y value sit at an array address of 1. So I'm going to close that so I have a little bit more room here. So if I look down here and say that my X value is at array address of 0, my Y value array address of 1. Change my comments to that. All right, so I got my X value, my Y value. Store X value into my X array, Y value into my Y array. What do I put for my where do I store them in those arrays? Say again. Yep. So let's close. Yeah, let me make sure we're saying the same thing. What do you mean by row? Oh, gotcha. So in this particular case, well, usually it's that because usually we're iterating through a list of numbers, right? For I in range 10, going from I equals 0 to I equals 9, right? However, here it's instead of range of whatever, it's a file. So it's file ID, which we've defined on line 22 as a file. So row is not a number. Row is a row of a text file. So we need to find something else to define what row, what element I'm storing these things in. Honestly, I don't have anything in this loop that's doing it right now. So I need to create some. Conveniently, I just did this both before, so let's do it again. Let's make a counter up. Starts at 0. Well, that's conveniently where I want to start these at, right? So I can just use counter as my array index, my array address, and then increment counter whenever I'm done. Sticky keys are on. Nice. All right, so let's give that a shot. After the array, I'm going to unindent and print off what's in X array, print off what's in Y array. So X array will print off first, Y array will print off second. I'll just put an empty print in the middle so that I can separate them. All right. So I'll have something like that going. What that does. Ooh, that's not any good. Cannot convert string to float. X. What does that mean? Yes. So if I pull up my text file again, the very first line is X and Y, right? And that error message says cannot convert string to float. And said X is the string that it's trying to convert to a float. And well, obviously you can't do that. X isn't a number. X is not a number. But why is it trying to do that? Why is it trying to convert X to a float? And where is it trying to do that? Actually, shouldn't ask that without looking at this again. It's saying it's trying to do it on line 33 is where it's trying to do that. So if I pop back into here, line 33, that's this guy. So I'm in my second loop where I'm storing my XY values for plotting. And it says it's trying to convert the character X to a float. And just like you said, Charles, X is the very first character on the very first row of that text file. So when it tries to read through that text file, it picks up the first row, tries to convert that first value, and it goes, oh crap, this is not a number. I don't know what the crap you're trying to get me to do. So we need to skip that first row again. So, well, how we did this last time coming up here was all this stuff. So let's just copy that and drop it down in here and see how it works. So counter equals 0, skip, but we don't want to necessarily change the value of counter, right? Because we're using that down over here for our array indices. So we need counter to start at 0. We just need to skip the first row. We just need to know when we've only done this once, right? So why not start counter like, I don't know, -1. Not a value that we really care about. And when we move on to the next item, let's just set counter to 0 so that it starts where we want it to. Does that make sense? How are we feeling about that? Yeah. Anything that you want in the for loop is indented. Everything I want in this if statement is also indented. That if statement's just there to skip the first row. Essentially, if that if statement is true, we skip that particular iteration. If it's not true, then we just do the iteration. Instead of using a continue, you could also use an else, like which might be what you're thinking of. Another way to do this would be to say that. That is an equivalent statement to using a continue in this particular case. The reason why you'd want to use a continue instead of an else in my head is that imagine you had about 100 lines of code that were in the loop. You'd had everything moved over, and if you have enough nested stuff, you're going to have a whole bunch of text on the far right side of the screen. It's going to be a pain in the butt to keep track of. So using the continue can make your life a little bit more straightforward. So that's my 2 cents on it. It's a little bit clean. It's a little bit cleaner. But those are 2 equivalent ways of writing this. Does that answer what you were getting at, Charles? Cool. Great. So let's see what that does. Yeah, there we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0. That's weird. What the heck's up with that? All right. Well, let's go back here. That shouldn't be. Okay. So it has 0 in there, which means that it went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. and gave me and somehow counted 6 rows instead of 5. What the heck? So let's see what's going on. Yeah. Okay. 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 So I like the way that you're going. You're saying that because we set counter equal to 1 in this first for loop here, where we're counting up rows, we're essentially counting the row that doesn't have any numbers, which we don't want to do. Which is it's called, and that's absolutely right. Thing is, if we don't change that value, it comes back around, grabs an extra. The value of the counter is still 0, right? We have to change it to something. Question is, what do we change it to so that we don't count an extra row? What if we break would stop the loop entirely? But let's look at how about something simpler. When we wanted to start counter at 0 down here, what do we do? What do we start counter at for our second loop? Right. And that let us set it to something like 0, which is what we'd want for the second loop, and conveniently also what we want for this first loop. Really, I could put any number in here. Heck, I could put like that in. I could put 900,000. I could put 99. -1's just a convenient value. Just a convenient value because I know that I'm not going to hit it ever in counting upwards. So instead of setting my counter at 1 to start the loop, I'll set the counter to 0, and I'll just start it at some other number. So in theory, I'm not counting the first row anymore. So write that, run that. There we go. Got my 5 values out. Life is great. Sweet. Any questions on that part? Yes. So up on line 10. Yeah. Change counter to start at -1 instead of 0. Because I know that my next number is always going to be 1 higher than where I am. So when I actually get into the loop and I start counting rows with numbers on them, I want the counter to start at 0. So I just need to start the counter at some other place, so that when I set it to 0 at the start of my numbers, I'm actually changing the counter to something else. So I can tell when I've moved off my first row. Does that make sense? All right. So now I have my X and Y values. Life is great. You know that they're the right size. You know that they're properly stored in arrays. So now I just have to, I forget how to use. There we go. You do not forget how to use matplotlib. There's always a bunch of stuff that I don't use very often, so I'm just shamelessly stealing from our example from the other day. So I just stole all the syntax from there. There we go. So I'm going to create a figure. I only have one line. I have one thing of data to plate. We have one set of data to plot. 49 and 50 let you plot 2 different data sets. So I'm just going to get rid of one of them. First value is my X. Second value is my y. Set my x label, x. Y label to be y. I'm not going to bother with the title. You don't have, and you don't have to. And I'll call it a day with that. Let's see what that does. Matplotlib? Yeah, you do. All going well over there? Okay, cool. So run that. Hopefully I'll get a line. Ooh, x is not defined. That's entirely fair because the name of my array is not x. It's what? X array. And there we go. Got myself a, I'm sure this shows up on the screen share. Got myself a little line plot here. Starts at x equals 1, goes to x equals 5, starts at y equals 2, goes to y equals 6, which is exactly what my data set is. So that's exactly what I'm looking for. And in theory, I pull up my input data. I could just keep on adding numbers here. In fact, I'm just going to copy a bunch of values. Paste a whole ton of values now, just for kicks and grins. And the code should automatically take care of that. Did I put it in the right file? Values.txt. That's 176 lines. Oh, that's why. So all my data is in there, all 176 data points, but because they're all on the same line, it just shows one line. So that's why I don't see them all. Oh, well, I was hoping I could show it, but I foiled myself. Cool. So that's that. So that's pulling in a unknown amount of data from a text file. Any questions on that? Anything else you'd like to see with that? Great. All right. Cool. Well, we only got 4 minutes left. Yeah. All right. So I can just talk. You can show it once. So if I didn't do all this, if I didn't do all that, if I didn't count the data in my text file, I'd have to kind of change how big my arrays were on the fly, because I wouldn't know how big to make them to start off with, right? So let's play that game once. The one trick with that is that with NumPy, you can't start with an empty array. You have to start with something. So it works really well for like our shrinking pellet problem, where we know what the first value is going to be. You know, the first value for time is going to be 0. First value for radius is going to be whatever the initial radius is. In our case, it's usually 0.1 centimeters. In this case, I kind of know what X array and Y array are going to be, right? For the X, it's going to start at 1. And I know that Y starts at 2. So I can kind of start those puppies off, or I can start them at some other place that kind of corresponds to where that line would go, right? And then what I can do, instead of storing the values directly in the array, what I can do is first make X value and Y value into arrays, what np.array does. And then I can stack up my array with those. So say I can do that, where I take the array that I started off with. In this case, X array starts. I define it as a numpy array with 1 value in it, as 0. I define the value that I extract from my text file as a second array, and I stack those two on top of each other and save it off as X array. When I come back through, I stack another value on there, and stack another value on there, and that again and again and again. So it's another way of doing the same thing. So if I haven't forgotten my syntax, oops. Oh, I did forget my syntax because there's always another set of brackets in there. Oh, I forgot something. And it gives me the same thing. So, however, it starts at 0, 1 now because I had to put in some initial value. So another way of doing the same thing, just with a little bit more uncertainty in what you know to start with. Any questions about it? Cool. Well, that's all I got for you today then. And if you ever need to review that, you'll be online soon.